One of the silver linings of 2020 has been the awakening of many camp professionals to the glaring lack of diversity in the camp industry. Besides camps that cater to inner city kids, summer camps, like many American institutions, have historically been a white proposition. Today, we will discuss again in part 2 of our amazing DEI Day Camp Pod, what we can do within our organizations to help make change. So thank you for joining us for this important discussion. This is the Day Camp Pod. Welcome back, my friends, to the Day Camp Podcast. I'm Andy Pritikin, Director of Liberty Lake in the Philly suburbs of New Jersey, joined along with Sam Thompson from Crystal Lake Park District in Chicago, and Tiff McDuffie of Purposeful Play from Milwaukee and Chicago. We are Day Camp pros dedicated to the professional development of our colleagues, discussing topics and best practices that can improve our organizations and ourselves. And today, we are joined again in a part 2 of an extremely important and urgent and sort of long podcast by 2 awesome individuals, graduates of Project Maury, mentees of my good friend Dawn Ewing, Dr. Lance Ozier, coming in from Atlanta, and Dr. Chanika Perry coming in from South Carolina. Make sure you check out our resources at daycamppodcast.com, the show notes. These guys give us tons of amazing links and books and stuff that can really help you, put you on the path of creating the kind of camp that most of us really, really want anyway. All right, so here it comes, part 2. Hit it, Matt. My second teaching job was in a town, South Orange and Maplewood, New Jersey, which is about 50% people of color, 50% white. Really wonderful town. And they were having a situation when I got there. This was in like the mid 90s, where all of a sudden gang violence started like cropping up. And then all of a sudden there was like a white flight thing, and the more wealthier white people started sending their kids to private schools at this really good school district. And they brought in a new principal the same year that I started there. And I remember being in this big, this was like the orientation day of teachers before school was going to start. So I'm in like the library with like 80 teachers, right? And it's definitely like the elephant in the room. There's no doubt about it. And there's a relatively diverse teaching staff. And the principal is young. He was like a 36-year-old white guy, amazing guy. He's now a superintendent. And he was like, look, this is a microcosm of our country, where our country's heading. I mean, here we have this great, I mean, we're a middle-class town. We have, we have money here, right? We have great, diversity in our school here. Like, if we can't make this work, like, what's that say about the American dream? Like, seriously, so that has sat with me for my whole life. And he did amazing stuff, and we turned the place around. But like, I feel like our camps are a microcosm of society too. And it's our obligation to set it straight, and to set things on the right path. And I know that most camp professionals feel this way. They just lack whether it's the confidence, like we're saying, avoiding the subject because it's uncomfortable, we don't know what to say, or just the tools. Like I'm saying, like now, if you become a school teacher, you're getting 2 semesters of diversity training. Like, it's in your curriculum, right?
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that I think could also help camp professionals is I have yet to see a camp truly that doesn't have values, right? That they espouse. And so even if you're on the green or the gold team, right? Like, there are values to your camp. I would love for camp directors and for camp staffs to really take a look at those values and whether and how they are living those out. If you say courage is a value and you're not having this conversation, you are not living up to your value. And I think sometimes that can be the thing that you just have to connect for a camp director and for a staff to really say, like, we do have to win on this. And if we don't win, like, who can? Like, we really are a microcosm. And so if we are a country that says democracy matters, liberty and justice matters, and then you look at our actions and behaviors and mindsets, again, it's one of the reasons why we struggle sometimes in this country, because there's such a disconnect. Camps are similar. And so I would challenge us and challenge everyone listening to really think about that. Start there. It's not starting outside with this really lofty ideal. It's really, let's evaluate ourselves. We said that independence matters. We said empathy matters. We said, right? Like, just go down the list. And if we're not having this conversation, that's the thing that I keep thinking about, listening to all of our anecdotes and all of the advice that we're giving. Like, it really is anchored in who we are, like who camps are, and the values that we kind of stand upon. And so I think like that work, and I'm hopeful, right, that people hear that too, and it hits a little differently, right? I know for me, as a former high school principal, that was real. Like, being able to look at all of our values and say, how is innovation really showing up? How is humanity really showing up? Because I say it's one of our 5 pillars, but is that true? And so I just wanted to throw that out there after your comment, Andy. You just made me think about that.
Humanity was one of your pillars?
It was.
That's a great one.
Unity was one. Yeah. And it's gosh.
Yeah. I'll just add to that, Chanika's point about centering values, which is such a good reminder, because camps have them, you know, and live by their missions and values. And I'll just add that these are not zero-sum games. Mm-hmm. There's enough of all of those values to go around. So in other words, we don't have to be afraid of, well, if I'm courageous, then, you know, maybe I'm losing something. No, we're all gaining something when we're courageous. There's enough courage for everybody to have a lot of it. There's enough kindness for everybody to have as much as they want. And so it's not about if I'm creating more of a value in a place that it somehow takes away from something that I already have. And those are often what leads to fear, is that I have to give something up. No, we can all have humanity and give it to kids at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that's all very key. I think what I'm seeing, and I'm always the one to like shake some things up, but like, we say we live by our values, but do we? You know, or I shouldn't even say that, but we oftentimes don't. And we oftentimes use them as buzzwords to sell enrollment spots into our camps. And when we're approached with, and I'm saying we, and I'm even still being passive by saying we, because I do live by my values, and I don't just use them as words to sell my camp. So, but I'm speaking as the industry, and, you know, injecting myself as a professional in this industry. Our values have to be lived and breathed. I went to this business conference once at this place called Infusionsoft, and their values were like written on the wall. So they were like visual reminders that this is who we are and this is what happens here. And it can't just happen only in our enrollment or only with the kids or only with the staff. Like, it has to be bred through and through. And when you're employing people, you have to, you know, be hiring them with your vision in mind, and your, you know, like, this is why we exist, and have every activity, as like obsessive as it seems, be tied to that. Like, when we're setting your goals, just even for the year, you need to start with why. And when I've been asked about consulting on this type of work in this space, I'm clear that I've really only been asked because I'm Black, you know, and so I do have some lived experience that I can add from that perspective. And I've encountered things, but I have no formal training in diversity and inclusion. I can just tell you, based on what I have experienced and what I've seen, what I see as the best practice. But the other thing that I see is an overwhelming sense of fear, not only fear of getting it wrong, but even like with Lance, when you were saying to Sam, like her response, like, and I think it's totally fine, Sam, to say, like, I'm going to have to talk to the parents. But I think what Lance is challenging, and I could be wrong, and you can correct me, Lance, is saying to say, you know, that we have to be so courageous as camp professionals to be able to say, hey, John, you know, I see that you all keep blaming Antonio, or, you know, whatever the other child's name is. And did you know that in our society, people blame Black people for crimes all the time that they didn't commit? And I know that you wouldn't, you know, that it wouldn't be your intention to blame someone for a crime that they didn't commit, but it's the same. because this child isn't even anywhere around and you keep blaming him. And I would hate to believe that you're blaming him just because he's Black, but that's what it seems like. And I can understand Sam's fear in having that conversation, because then the mama would be like, you clown my kid a racist today? So I'm just like, I don't know how to help. I do agree Sam needs to have that direct conversation with that child, especially though as a director in like a parks program where she doesn't own it. Like me, I could say like, who gonna check me? So do what you gotta do. But with Sam, she works for someone else, so she has to like, win the line. So I understand the fear, but I still feel like as camp professionals, we have to find a way to work past that. And maybe that is like Sam or whomever operating in their own personal why. So like the why can't just be the camp why, it has to be like your own personal thing that is so strong and courageous that like, well, whatever happens with the park, with your mama, with whoever, I believe that this is what is happening. And I believe, I'm so into being, so anti-racist that I'm going to address this because it's what I see, and admitting that I may be wrong, but this is how this feels and this is what I see, and so, I feel both sides of it, but when you deal with people who are like be putting their lives and their wages on the line for being anti-racist, you just like, oh yeah, that would be nice, but I got to feed my family. And so I understand the struggle. The other thing is, there was a woman who approached me about doing this, and she couldn't answer, like, what's their why? I'm like, well, why? Like, they wanted to do it basically. And, she may have been afraid to say, but I always tell people like, just tell me the truth. Like, I'm no judgment. So she's like, well, we want to do it because everybody else is doing it. We want to do it because we believe it's right. But if we start to do this, like, we're going to piss off all our funders. Mm-hmm. And we're not trying to lose our money just because of what we believe, because then there's no program for anybody. So is it really doing good? Like that.
But if one of your pillars is humanity, if one of your pillars is unity, like if that's what you talk anyway, then to me, like, I don't even know why you're questioning yourself. But I get it, Tiff. And a month or so ago, there was this whole like Black Lives at Camp thing, right? And people were posting that stuff and all. And I know camp people at private camps who were getting, one rotten apple out of hundreds of people who were just like, I'm pulling my kid out of camp. I can't believe you're getting all political. I'm not sending my kid to your camp to be political. It's not a political issue,
And let me clarify real quick. I did talk to the child, but that wasn't helping. So it was time to go to the parents and say, maybe this isn't the program for you, because, we did have that.
Well, that's where I was heading with this, is that this may not be the camp for certain staff people and for certain parents who send their kids there. That's not part of the deal.
I did tell that person who I was consulting with, I said, and for certain funders, there's plenty more money. It's more ways to go give. If you're going to live and die by your ideals, you have to do. It's a brave work. It's not an easy work. It's not a comfortable work. You're like, no, it's not just going to be uncomfortable. You might lose campers. You might lose funders. You might lose some stuff, but what you're gaining is real purpose, intention, and connection with what you say you are. Right. And the thing I was saying about that Infusionsoft place was one of their pure pillars was, we do what we say we will. And if you're not doing it, if you're not brave enough, then you don't do what you say you will. So how can you teach a whole generation of kids to do all these lofty things if we won't even do what we say we will? So it's disheartening.
Right. And just like when you don't want to fire somebody, you don't want to have that when you do these difficult things, what does it do? It solidifies your values, and it makes people go, wow, look at that. Like, this is real. Right.
And I think it's the reframe, and that's work that you have to do with the entire community. Like, it is not a win or a lose, right? Like, so I think even to your point, Andy, and I know like, and Tiff, you talk about losing funders, like in our work, we talk all the time about how that's actually not a loss. Like, you have to calibrate what the loss is and understand. And so if you really are saying this is who we are, then the people who are not on board, you didn't lose them. They were never on board with your mission and your vision to begin with. And so they needed to pivot the same way that you needed to pivot. And so you don't stand to lose anything. You have only reaffirmed who you are. And I think that's so important. And my executive director, he just said this the other day, Tiff, you might've been in the room, girl. I think you might've been there. He was like, for every funder that you could lose because they feel like you have somehow changed who you are, you'll gain two. And if you think about that, right? Or there will be two additional people who are very excited that you have finally taken a stand, because they didn't really know who you were to begin with. You were kind of like hanging out in this safe space, not taking a stance, which communicates nothing. And so I think that is important. And Sam, the only other thing I would add about the conversation is I'm constantly trying to convince people that it's not one person's conversation to have, right? And so I think that's the important thing about going to the parents. Has to be our collective conversation. And if we are not all having the same conversation, then you have to talk to somebody else. And so I think it's hard, I think, to get to that point when you're having those conversations, but it's about mission and vision alignment and truly like going towards inclusivity. Like that's really important in all of our work.
And Sam, I had a camper, like a 7th grade boy who crossed the line, maybe like, I don't know, 6th grade boy crossed the line and said some pretty egregious racist things. And I had to call that kid's parent. And that parent was so mortified. She pulled the kid out of camp and made that kid that weekend, like watch the 12-hour Ken Burns documentary on civil rights movement. Like she was just like, I haven't done my duty. Like as a parent here, because I've been too scared to talk about things, you know, and this kid's been sitting there playing video games, you know, up at 3 a.m, listening to people say all kinds of racist things on the video games, you know, and that's how he's learning. And I'm not doing my part as a parent. So, you know, I think we're parenting children too. That's part of of what we do.
And I know we've kind of, you know, dropped names and resources along the way. Sam, I'll just add to that, and others that have mentioned your reference bias and stereotypes. Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford wrote a must-read book called Bias. She's kind of the leading expert on bias research. And it's such an important book, I think, for staff of day camps who are ready to confront bias. One of the major points she makes is that bias are natural. We have them as humans. They come from our kind of reptilian part of our brain. But what we can't do is normalize them. We have to act in ways that dismantle the ones that lead to negative interactions with people. So that's my recommendation, a real life-changing book.
That's great. And I'm going to hit you guys up afterwards. I'll email you guys any kind of links you can give us that we could put in our show notes that could be resources to people that, you know, for many people, it's literally, we're at 101 with it. You know, and you know, staff training is a big deal. You know, we want to help the staff. And one of the things I've been picking up and listening to your ACA webinar, which I recommend to everybody, listen to that. It's online for free. You can get it if you're an ACA member. And also reading a lot of these great books, like the bias book, White Fragility and all that, is that when you're teaching the staff stuff, is to do it with a person of color. You know, if you're a white person, that, you know, it comes across so much better. It just does, you know, when you're hearing people, you know, really talk about it from their heart.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I think we can talk about that, because I think there are different models of facilitation based on what your goals are. So, you know, I think there's a time and a place for co-facilitation where you have a white person and a person of color. Co-facilitating, you have to think about what the reason and the outcome of that decision are, and whether that's the right move to make. White people have to stop waiting around on Black people and people of color to do all the work. So I think we have to be careful when we put the lift and the burden on our colleagues of color to be the spokesperson all the time. And yet there are times when co-facilitation and representation matters, absolutely, which is different than when white people are working together, which are called affinity groups. And you can have affinity groups of different identities, which is another model to think about. You know, when do white people need to have conversations to be anti-racist alone, so that they're not putting the burden and spirit murdering our colleagues of color, because white people are going to get it wrong. We're going to mess up. That's part of the process of understanding our whiteness. so I think, it's a decision that I think camps have to make about what's the facilitation model, what's the goal, because of the outcome, and being conscious and aware of our privilege, if you're a white person, that we get to walk through life without the burden that Black people and people of color walk around with being asked constantly to represent and to speak. And white people have to do the work as well. And then another thing that I think is important to remember is we need everybody. We need hundreds of millions of people to change behavior, to work to dismantle systems. And so my point about getting it wrong is to normalize that. I'll name another book that's been important for me. Ijoma Ulalu wrote So You Want to Talk About Race. There's a chapter in there where she talks about her white mother who raised 3 Black children, getting it wrong. And what's so endearing about that chapter is she's talking about her mother, who she loves, and her mother who loved 3 Black children. And then her mother would say something, and Ijoma's like, oh, Mom. I mean, clearly this white woman loved Black people. And yet she did what all white people do, which is we have to figure it out, because we live in a coding of privilege that protects us from having to work at this.
Yeah.
And when you decide to do it, and it's not a race, by the way, of who's the better white person. And by the way, you don't get a medal for doing this. This is what you have to do. And so it's just important to not be afraid of getting it wrong in these facilitation models, but also work really, really hard to get it better, and to do that work yourself.
I love that. I also think, to add another resource there, Thandika wrote a book that I have recommended to the moon and back, and it's called Learning to Be White, because that's learned, right? Like that's learned. And so in terms of getting people to recognize and have those conversations and say, oh, actually, you weren't just born understanding white and power associations, like that all happened to you too. And so I think that's an important read. It was important for me to even read as a Black person. So thinking about that across staffs as well. And then Lance is spot on with affinity groups. And I talk about affinity groups all the time as well. It's really important as a camp to show openness to that type of space. If you have a staff that has Black people on it, but they are not the majority, you best believe they already have an affinity group. It's the white people who might not have the affinity group, but Black people will always find themselves. We find each other. Even at Maury's camp, before, to Lance's point, before there was a greater representation, we were the BWC, the Black Women Committee. There weren't that many of us. And so you find yourself and you have the conversations and you do the work together. And I think that's really important. And probably the largest gap that I have seen is that you just don't see that many camp directors or staff saying, hey, we do have an affinity group that really is for white people to be together doing this work, because that weight and that burden is really high and heavy. And it's a natural inclination that if you are in a mixed group, if race comes up, your head is going to swivel or your eyes are going to kind of cut to the side because you're going to worry about getting it wrong. And you have to create safer spaces. And they're not really safe. And I hate that word, right? In this context, they're just brave spaces. Tiff, you said the word brave before, and that's real. They're brave spaces where that level of vulnerability just looks differently, right? If Lance is in a room with Andy and he's able to say, I just don't know what to do with this. Like, this is what I'm experiencing. You're probably more likely to have that conversation there and own like your angst in a different way than a Tiff and I, where they're listening as well. And so I think that that is huge. And starting that from the onboarding experience throughout orientation, talking about it when you're recruiting staff and being really open about, hey, our staff looks like it's comprised of this demographic. And we really do encourage affinity groups that are discussing maybe similar text. Again, there's so many resources. maybe all of you have taken Harvard's implicit association test, which I love, right? And you're debriefing those results together in your own affinity group. That's so powerful before coming back to the whole group.
There's camps out there that have been around for 60, 70, 80 years. I mean, you talk about systemic, like they've been doing things the same way. And it's just, this is how we've done it kind of thing. And if the directors are older folks, you know, you need affinity groups or you're going to get any change in some of these places, right? Because it needs to sort of come from within, right? It's not going to come from top down necessarily.
No, I totally agree. I was going to say that if there is an all-white group talking about anti-racism, the people who do have, you know, like you said, everyone has biases, but they'll just be more willing to speak honestly and freely versus wondering what I think about what you think. You know what I mean? Because there will be some people, like I know even in some of the day camp groups where they were saying like, you know, just, you know, make it a goal in your goals to hire X number of people of color. And then some people were just like, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm just not doing it. I'm going to pick people who are qualified and you can think what you want to think about me. So those were the bold people who were really willing to say like, I'm not making it a goal. But there are tons of other people who feel that way who would never admit it because in front of me, but they really think it. And so since they don't have that space to really tell you how they feel, then there's no way for Lance or you or whomever is already tried to do more of that self-work to give them guidance to say, I understand why you feel like that, but recognize that even that is privilege. And then if you look at it, like the most qualified people might be the people who only had a camp experience, and a lot of Black people didn't have a camp experience, so they can't be the most qualified. And so you're not just picking them just because they're Black, but if we really want to diversify, we have to present a new opportunity to people who need to learn now and who don't have the most qualifications, but because it's our goal to make this space different, you know, and then you can like unpack it a little bit, just like we would unpack with the kids, because those thoughts came from somewhere and it's not wrong. Like, who doesn't want the most qualified person? It makes everybody's job easier, but this is why we can't only focus on the most qualified people. So I think those groups without me in the room definitely get more honesty out in the air so that you can actually break down the self-limiting beliefs about why it can't happen. The other thing I was thinking was being scared is a privilege, right? Being scared is privilege. Not being brave, don't want to have the conversation. Oh my God, it's uncomfortable. What are they going to think? I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm just going to tap out. That is all privilege. And if you think about that, my interaction with that was like, it was heartbreaking to see these babies, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, marching and, you know, Black Lives Matter. And these babies, you know, who you think like, I would want to shield my children from that. I have privilege in that my children didn't have to be in the middle of that. Their mom is, you know, I'm an activist, but I'm not going out there to the protests to catch Corona, you know, like I wasn't going. So my kids were able to be shielded, but there's some people where this is happening in their communities I can say that because you know, I live in this fancy building, you know, like it don't happen over here. It doesn't mean that I don't have the same empathy or that my heart is not there, but I just wasn't going out there. So I have to recognize that even I have more privilege. Some of these people, it's not that they wanted their kids to be out there. They were totally powerless to the people, but this could happen to them tomorrow. It could happen to me and my children, but we're further removed. So I have a privilege of saying, I'm not going. Whereas, you know, it was still just so heartbreaking to see the smallest babies. And so I did have white friends who were at home and just like, I just turned off the news because, you know, it's just, I can't let Johnny watch that. Oh, well, the Black kids don't have no choice but to watch. So hiding and not having the conversation, like that is a privilege that, you know, Black people just don't have. And so just to boldly step out. And it's funny because we did end up, because I forced my kids to watch, you know, and again, I have my own set of privilege, but when we could go close to a protest and yet still keep I wanted them to be able to see and experience, and I still had the very deep conversations about why this is important and why this matters. And my kids go to a very diverse school, so I employed them to teach their friends. And so in that way, we're still getting like the messaging out there, but you know, like nobody gets it right all the time, Black people included. It's not like just because we're Black, we're experts on the subject.
And you know, you mentioned that they go to a diverse school. So like this school that I taught at, that was a 50-50 school. There were more issues of racism and stuff in there than there are in a school that's 95%, you know, one way or the other. Because the more you put it together, the more kids are going to mess up with each other. right? It's just normal stuff. It's just how we debrief it and how we deal with it. That seems to be an issue.
Yeah.
Get brave. Hashtag get brave. That's the model from this.
I don't know, Tiff. I think we're going to name this podcast "Being Scared is a Privilege." I think that's
yes, that's so good.
But Tiff, you're so right to name it. It is a privilege, and I think we have to recognize that we all have privileges, as you said. Privilege is a human condition of which there are many, and I think often white people, when confronted with the reality of white privilege, get defensive. Mm-hmm. And say, but I have problems too.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely right. We all have problems. We all have challenges. Our problems and our challenges are not made greater because we are white. And that's what white privilege means. Yes, we all have different privileges and we all have different challenges. White peoples are not more so because they are white. Defensiveness is a reaction that white people have to deal with. I just want to say, in terms of white affinity groups, it can't just be a lot of white people talking, because that talking about race
circles.
doesn't go well. It has to be grounded in something. I recommend a couple things. One is a document called Positive White Identity Development, which talks about stages of developing positive white identity, or what is now being called healthy white identity. Even though the term positive white identity was coined by a Black woman, it's sometimes seen as a little outdated, this idea of positive white identity, and maybe healthy white identity is a more appropriate name. It talks about the stages of identifying as white in a healthy way, understanding the difference between shame and guilt, so that you don't feel guilty for things that you didn't do, but you take responsibility and not feel that you're a bad person, which is shame. Shame, I'm a bad person. Guilt, I did something bad. And to use those as structures for conversations in white affinity groups. So that you're not going around in circles and using self-pity, which is another pitfall that white people have to avoid, is that this isn't about us feeling sorry for ourselves. There's nothing to feel sorry for. So move beyond that, use a document like Positive White Identity as a structure to have the conversation, so that we can be a part of a community that validates and affirms the individuals and their identities in places like camps.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about at our pre-meeting last week was the phrase came out and said, the goal of most camps is uplifting all humanity, right? And I think all camp directors would agree with that. It's just then now what do we do about it? Actually doing it. And I said, we're sort of like co-parents with our kids. We're helping raise children the right way, right? And in doing that, we many times have to sort of help parents. Parents did not, get a degree in parenting before they became parents. They just became parents, and then they had to learn on the spot. And there's many times where you got spoiled kids, or you got kids with bad behavior and stuff, and you have to be like, you know what? They're suspended, or they're kicked out of camp, or they got to do this, they got to do that, because that's how they're going to learn. It's serious. And I think that now that DEI has been such it's coming to this tipping point, right? I think that becomes part of what we do, and I think people just can't dismiss it as this little afterthought thing. It has to be in there. It's a pillar, and that's why I love that humanity and unity were pillars at that place, that school you worked at, because in a way, that's what it should be like at camps too. It can't just be about teamwork and independence, which are the big, camp kind of phrases, right? But it needs to, in a way, it'd be more broader, so that we can affix these traits and these slip ups that are going to happen to that, to align it to that.
Yeah. I want to recommend another thing, because camps love activities. And Andy, you said, people want to do something. I'm falling in love with this book. I don't know, Chanika, if you've seen this, Annalise Singh's The Racial Healing Handbook.
Mm-hmm.
It's filled with activities that would be really wonderful for staff training, would be really wonderful at developmentally appropriate stages for campers. At Maury's camp, we had a social justice program activity. It was embedded into the camp program, co-facilitated by staff and camper to have conversations about the lived experiences and realities that campers were having. These would be wonderful activities for staff and campers, used intentionally. We talk about intentionality at camp all the time. We don't just do something for the sake of doing it. It has to be intentional, aligned to the mission, aligned to values, aligned to what we want the outcome to be. But this is a really wonderful resource.
Oh, that's awesome, Lance. I appreciate that. What I was telling Lance, but before we started, I said, we want to give people some takeaways. So we're gonna have a nice long list of hyperlinks. There's no doubt about that, and I know we definitely inspire people. Any closing statements, folks, as we wind up the longest day camp pod in history, but it's well worth it. That's okay. No. This is a hot topic, and we got to stick with it. But anything else you'd like to inspire our folks to take action, and do something about our situation? The platform is yours.
I think we're playing double dutch. I'll start, and then Lance, I can throw it to you. Just going to end a couple of things. One takeaway for me is always that silence is violence. It really is. Silence is violence. And when it comes to this conversation about race and about seeing each other and seeing our campers, we can't just be silent and then be an ostrich with our head in the sand. We have to have the conversation. We must. For camp directors, I think the takeaway that I would have, same as I had as a principal, is yes, you care about your campers because they are your kids. Your counselors and your staff are also your kids. If you are a camp director, you have to think about them the exact same way. They're just little kids and big kids. That's the way I always said, even as a principal. I had my little kids who were my high schoolers and my babies, and my big kids who were the ones who were in charge of taking care of them every single day. And the same values that I had in the school, was not doing my job if I didn't try to make sure that those values were also instilled in my staff. And so I would really encourage all camp directors to kind of broaden the scope of the work to make sure that they're also seeing other adults. This work is not just about creating more empathetic, inclusive kids. It's about creating better human beings. And they're across all ages. So I think that that's really important work. I know one of the things that I always think of in this work too is that there is not a point where you have arrived. And I know Lance says this a lot too, like there's not gonna be a destination where you landed at SFO, you got off the plane and look at God, you're over in San Francisco and things are great. You are never going to arrive. And so I really wanna challenge us not to think about like, either I got it, check, or I don't have it, check. This really truly is a journey and a work in progress, but you gotta take the steps. You gotta take the first step and you gotta keep on walking. That's
a great point, Chanika, because I feel like a lot of camp directors are perfectionists, and they want to be able to put a little bow on it and move on to the next thing. And no, this is an ongoing conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah. And to piggyback on that, a couple of things for white people specifically, it's not about being the better white person or the best anti-racist, to Chanika's point. It's a continuation of learning. And especially for white people, especially listening to people of color, and not just like hearing what people say, which might include being uncomfortable and might challenge you to not be defensive and to try to defend it. And something that's been really life-changing for me, it comes from Ijoma Ulalu's book. She has this line that says, if a person of color thinks it's about race, then it is about race. And for white people to be able to hear that, and when a person of color says, yeah, it's about race. Women often can relate to that because, if a woman feels that it's about her gender and then a man tries to mansplain it, well, maybe they didn't mean that. Maybe they didn't, maybe that's not what really happened. Okay, listen, if a person says it's about what they know, then it's, if they think it's about race, then it's about race. And I say that because on this journey of learning and listening, white people have to do a better job of believing people of color, and especially Black people. And in staff trainings and orientations and in conversations where you're planning what the goal is and what the outcomes are, listen. If you're a white person, listen.
Yeah, along the lines of what you were saying about believing and that kind of thing. Just to quote Jeff Ackerman, who's another Project Maury, founder guy. He is one of my mentors. He's still around. My first year as a camp professional, he got me a shirt that said, "Perception is reality." Mm-hmm. Right. And this became like this mantra, right? Because especially when I was like 28 years old, I thought I knew everything kind of guy, he's like, like, what other people believe is actually what's important, so great point. All right. Well, thank you, Chanika. Thank you, Lance. This has been wonderful. This is an all-timer. Really appreciate you doing this. This is great. Hopefully this will help a lot of people. I want to thank the Go Camp Pro team, AM Skyer, commercial recreation specialist, for allowing us to bring this podcast to you. If you like what you hear, you should subscribe to the Day Camp Pod on your favorite podcast platform. Check out our show notes from this magnificent show of lots of hyperlinks and our other episodes at daycamppodcast.com, as well as contact info for Lance and for Chanika and for our wonderful co-hosts Sam and Tiff. So thanks for listening and making yourself a better day camp professional. We'll be back next week with another full episode of the Day Camp Pod.